Hi, Assalamualaikum. Tablighi Jamaat, a global Islamic Piety movement which has captured the hearts and minds of millions in Pakistan and beyond, has become a new romantic thing in religious studies. To talk about Tablighi Jamaat and its politics, though it claims to be apolitical or politically neutral, but despite it has certain kind of politics, I have with me Dr. Arsalan Khan. Dr. Khan is an assistant professor at University of Tennessee. He's an anthropologist. He recently got published his book, The Promise of Piety, which is a wonderful book. I really love this book. Thank you so much, Dr. Khan, for joining me.
Thank you, Farah, for having me. I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you. First of all, many congratulations for getting the wonderful get published.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's a long process. Feel like maybe some students are watching. It took many years. I finished my PhD in 2014, 15. So, if anyone's out there struggling to write, remember it takes a long time, and finally it starts to fit together and come together. So,
Honestly, it is a lot. Like you did your PhD in 2014, right?
15, yeah.
Oh my God, it's a lot.
Yes, yes, it takes a while. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. But okay, perfect. So in this interview, in this conversation, we will have like three sections probably. In the first section, I will ask you to explain the main argument, the contents of the book. In the second section, we will talk about some empirics and some historical context of the arguments you are making. And finally, we will talk about a little bit about the broader theoretical implications of your work about religion and modernity in the globalized world. So, my first question to you is, what is the argument?
What is the argument? I think the argument, is really about the kind of way in which modernity has reconfigured religion, right? And it's created religion as a certain kind of space, a site for the construction of social relationships, and a site for the kind of creation of sovereign power. And so, lots of the anthropology of religion, inspired by Talal Asad, and of course religious studies as well, has opened up this sort of focus on religion as a sort of modern category, a modern domain tied to the origins of secularism. And so, one of the core arguments that I try to make in this book is that what we need to attend to is the different ways in which the category of religion and the domain of religion are constituted in practice, how those relate, how the boundary between religion and non-religion is created, how it's constituted in everyday life and everyday practice, and the forms of social relationships that emerge out of that, the forms of identity, masculinity, subjectivity that emerge out of that, and ultimately the forms of sovereign conceptions of sovereign power and sovereign authority that come out of that. And my argument in this is I look at the Tablighi Jamaat very carefully as a site for the creation of a certain type of sociality, a certain type of relationality, and how that relationality generated in the ritual practices and everyday life of the Tablighi congregation become the basis for the construction of a kind of moral order, an imagination of a type of moral order in which the domain of religion has the hierarchical central place. It's the encompassing domain of social life. And so, how that ends up, how they create that domain in ritual practice, and how, on the basis of the everyday ethical relationality created in that space, they aim to transform the thing they call the world, the dunya, right? So, the deen dunya distinction as a constitution, how that's constituted, and how the deen then ends up becoming the basis for a certain type of transformation. The second thing I really emphasize in the book is that this boundary between religion and non-religion, deen, dunya, in the Islamic context, is a contested site. Different groups have different ideas, and I contrast the Tablighi strongly with various kinds of both traditionalist forces, whether that be Brelvi ulama and Brelvi movements, or even Sufi understandings in general on the one hand, and then also against modernist conceptions like liberalism and Islamism. So that's how I frame the
Perfect.
book.
Thank you. How is this book, the arguments you are making, they are different from the similar books and arguments in your area of study?
I draw a great deal, of course, on what has preceded, and I make it a point not to say, "Oh, I'm rejecting all of that work." I mean, there's been a considerable amount of work on Islamic movements in anthropology that come out of the same kind of tradition that I'm drawing on, Talal Asad's work, etc. Sabah Mahmood and Charles Erskine are both um, kind of very famous representatives who looked at Salafi movements, piety movements in Egypt, and the way in which those piety movements constructed ideas about agency and ideas about kind of how society should be shaped according to the principles of Islam. So I think that my work draws a great deal on linguistic anthropology and semiotic anthropology, and I think that the work um, that the Sabah Mahmood's work, for instance, has came under a lot of criticism for not attending to the sort of plurality of social forms that exist in Muslim life, the ambivalences and ambiguities of everyday life. So there was a kind of critique of that work for almost replicating too closely the ideas of the pietists that were being studied in that work. And not attending to the kind of possibilities that are the plurality of potential subject positions within Muslim societies, whether that be Egypt. Pakistan, as you know, is a very, very diverse country with many claims and types of claims about Islam and Muslim life in general. And so that plurality really was important for me. So the core point I make theoretically, the shift is that Sabah Mahmood and all use a kind of Foucauldian conception of self-cultivation. They focus on the way that rituals and religious practices in general are modes by which a sort of a pious self is constituted. So through practice, one becomes a pious self. Now, this is not, I don't reject that. I agree, because if you talk to Tablighis, their understanding of Dawat is very much modeled on this idea. But I think analytically, it's very important to attend to the type of social relationships and the relationality that's constituted, and the way in which that relationality must navigate a kind of plural play. So I argue that I use an approach that I take from a long line of thinkers, whether that be Irving Goffman, that look at the constitution of that relationality in practice, in ritual practice, and everyday practices of Dawat. And I think that what we gain from that subtle shift, it's not a rejection again of that work by any stretch of the imagination. What we gain is a real attention to the way in which particular types of religious practices constitute certain uh, kind of social relationships and constitute certain kind of institutional forms. They give definite institutional form to the domain of religion, which I think sometimes gets lost a little bit in the discussion of abstract tradition in the kind of general sense. So how that tradition gets institutionalized, thing like that in a movement like the Tablighi Jamaat, the what's so striking about it is it's that it's a really organized social movement, and it has a definite institutional form. So I'm interested in the way that institutional form is created in the practices of Dawah.
Excellent. So, how it has been received so far? What has been the reaction by scholarly community, by anthropologists, political scientists from my area? So, what has been the reaction?
I mean, the book has not been out that long, so in terms of formal engagement, in terms of reviews, up till now, it has not. I mean, I know there are a few reviews that are in the works. My book has come out after a series of articles I've published as well. The first article I published, I'm sorry, one thing I forgot to say is that one of the central themes in the book is the way that relationality within the Tablighi Jamaat is constituted hierarchically. So I look at the kind of hierarchies that are generated within the movement. So I've written a number of articles. My first article was on what I call the ethics of hierarchy, which took the central theme of that, the way in which Tablighi the institutional structure is created within Dawat as a sort of hierarchical relationality to other pious selves. So I focus in, for instance, on the idea of sobat. Sobat in the Tablighi Jamaat, within the Tablighi congregation, sobat is companionship, pious companionship is really a key instrument. So for the cultivation of self, and sobat involves a set of sort of submission to pious authorities, and I argue being acted upon by pious others. So it's not just you create your pious self, but you create your pious self through definite forms of social relationships with others. So I've written a series of those articles, and those articles have generally been well accepted. So I am looking forward to people reading the book and responding to it, and including criticisms of it. I'm happy. I just hope that people engage it. And so, right up till now, I have presented the work in many places, and people have engaged it very well, and I have not. I will say that there of course, and this is not unique to my work. This was true for Sabah Mahmood's work. This was true for Charles Erskine's work, but Sabah Mahmood in particular. There's a certain kind of liberal or secular response to work that tries to take seriously the ethical life of Islamic actors. So there's a kind of like knee-jerk hostility sometimes that does arise. I have experienced that in public spaces when I presented my work sometimes. So people who think that I'm excessively I'm not dealing critically enough with the Tablighi claims, and so I've tried to over time. I've presented my work many places, including many times in Pakistan, and I've always gotten a good engagement from people on it. And but despite but and I've tried to incorporate some of those criticisms in the work as well. So
Awesome. So now my question is about the content. What makes Dawat so captivating?
yeah. I think that's really the central question of the book, right? I mean, I think that we have these revivalist movements. Firstly, I will add that the Tablighi Jamaat fits in broader revivalist currents across the world. It's not just Dawat that is captivating. In many ways, there are revivalists of all kinds. There's various kinds of Hadith, uh, Brelvis, Salafis within Islam in general. But of course, there are there's Pentecostalism and other forms of Christianity that have also swept through Latin America and have swept through um, all parts of Africa. So, I think it's interesting to put the Tablighi Jamaat within that broader frame of movements in the world that are sort of trying to address some of the problems of modernity or think through some of the crises of modernity. Okay, so what makes Dawat captivating in particular? I think that what I found most interesting is the way in which Tablighi see Dawat as the enactment of a model of morality, of interaction, of relationality in a very nitty gritty way of adab and speak, a kind of ethics of relationality, right? In the way that people interact with each other that they don't find in the broader Pakistani society. And so I think that what I'm trying to argue, in the book is really that we need to attend to the way in which a certain kind of morality, sociality, and ethical relations are created within these spaces, and people, those sort of the sense of emergent belonging of an ethical belonging, I show is contrasted sharply with what Tablighis perceive outside. So one core part of this argument is that there's a certain type of masculinity that involves not being too aggressive, not being too assertive, but instead listening, to people with authority and containing and controlling what are seen as the passions of the nafs, the lower self. So I make this argument that this kind of everyday ethics and masculinity and ethical selfhood is created within this movement that Tablighis contrast to the chaos of the world. The hierarchies of the Tablighi Jamaat are contrasted to the moral chaos, the fitna of the world and hierarchies. So the central question then becomes, well, what is the appeal or the value of this kind of hierarchy generative in these religious practices as a solution to crises or problems that are perceived in the world?
But
So
do Tablighis agree with your conclusion or your claim that there are hierarchies in Tablighi Jamaat? Because generally they believe that they are different from Brelvis or those who have certain kind of hierarchy. So do they agree with this claim?
I think they would agree with the claims about hierarchies of authority, right? So their problem with the Brailwi is and with Sufi forms in general, the Pir Murid forms, the Pir Muridi forms that we have in Pakistan is they think there's too much hierarchy there, right? There's too much belief in the
Right.
power of others,
Yeah.
including intercessionary powers, tawassul, the power to mediate
Right.
in a real kind of way. So they reject that hierarchy, right? Now, they're egalitarian in an ontological sense, in a sense of being all Muslims, or Muslim men at least, right, are ontologically equal. You and me, we're equal, but we can be differentiated by the piety that we have acquired through our enactment of the prophetic model. So it's less a model of people are just higher and lower, and more a model of a sort of ascent up a hierarchy. And I think that the notion of darja and darjat and the idea of moving up and in a hierarchy, I think they definitely accept the idea that you're supposed to kind of find people who have that kind of piety and emulate them in everyday life is also, I think, most of them will accept this idea that there are other people who are exemplary, that one must follow, one must listen to, one must emulate, and therefore that's the pathway to the life. And I make it clear in this, I'm not arguing that hierarchy is one thing. I mean, Sufi hierarchy is based on genealogy or blood, are rejected in a sense, or at least subordinated to the hierarchies of piety. So hierarchies of piety, I make it very clear in the book, there are distinct types of hierarchy constituted and naturalized. By that I mean they take on a sort of for granted form through a process of the ritual processes that I described. So I called it the ethics of hierarchy simply because I didn't have a better phrase for why the way in which Tabligis seek authority is a kind of, and connect to authority is a kind of a sort of hierarchical ethics. In the Tablighi Jamaat, because when you begin on the premise of equality, all Muslim men are equal, anyone in the masjid is effectively equal, hierarchy is not the same as if you go to a dargah, right, or a shrine, right? I mean, those hierarchies are materialized in concrete form in physical material space. So the hierarchies of a thing like the Tablighi Jamaat have to be located, and so people are constantly looking for the signs of piety and connecting to those signs of piety. And so the hierarchy is not as clear cut as many other social forms have clear cut.
I'm sorry for the interjection, but when you talk about Hazrat in your book, it gives me the same impression. The impression you are talking about the Brailvis when they go to a dargah. Hazrat gives me, when I was reading that part, I was like, wait a minute, is it the work about the Brailvis or is it about Tablighi Jamaat? So, what is the difference between the way Tablighis have reverence for the Hazrat compared to the Brailvis' respect for their dargahs or shrines?
Yeah. Well, many people outside the Tablighi Jamaat would critique Tablighis for replicating those same type of hierarchies that they reject. So this is a question of interpretation and of what kind of signs. But Tablighis will insist that we don't follow our Hazrat, right? We don't follow our Buzurgs in the way that they do. We follow them because they are embodiments and have emulated the prophetic model. Right now, you can disagree with that, right? But for them, the piety is linked to their practice, and this is very important, right? The piety is not intrinsic to them as people. It's not genealogical necessarily, right? It has to do with what are perceived as the signs. This is why I'm interested in the semiotic question, the signs of piety that they embody and emulate. So they'll say, no, our relationship to God, right? Our relationship to God is direct. Nobody is in between us and God. So I make the argument that one of the key elements of modernity is this idea that we must have a directness to God. We must connect to God directly. But of course, you always need some ways in which that transcendent is immanent in real places, people, things, objects, right? All transcendence must be materialized in some way. This is a philosophical claim on my part. And it's materialized in, I say, the personas of the Buzurgs, but also in the mosque, in the way that Tablighis find piety among people. So one of the arguments I make is that sobat is a kind of like, yes, you're submitting to authority, but you also have to recognize that authority, those virtues in other people, and so you're searching for them, and you're trying to submit yourself to these things, and you're trying to find them. So that's my argument. So people may object to my use of the word hierarchy because yes, it's different from genealogical hierarchies in Sufism. It's certainly different from classical anthropological takes of hierarchy, like Louis Dumont's work on the Hindu caste system. But I'm interested in theorizing hierarchy in modernity, and I'm interested in thinking about the way that people, even if they have a premise egalitarian. Now, it's egalitarian in a way that it's only men are equal, right? I don't really think women fit into that egalitarianism. But then that generates these particular types of hierarchical relationships. So that's my argument.
Fascinating. So you talked about modernity, and the Tablighi Jamaat presents an alternative to liberal secular idea of moral order. This was very striking to me, honestly. What does it mean? What do you want to say that this is an alternative to the liberal secular idea of moral order?
Yeah, I don't think this part is so unique to my work, right? The anthropology of Islam, whether it be Asad or it be Sabah Mahmud's work, that genealogy has set Islamic pieties, notions of subjectivity, notions of agency against the sort of liberal and secular form, right? And the thing about liberalism is that it presupposes the individuality, right? It presupposes the individual as sort of almost prior to and existing prior to and social relationships. And so the individual, this is basically just extension of Sabah Mahmud's work, but many people in anthropology other than Sabah Mahmud have been critiquing individualism, whether that be Louis Dumont or be there's a long history of these kinds of ideas. They're often, I think, for people who are not familiar with anthropological theories, history, often it gets all attributed to Talal Asad and Sabah Mahmud. But actually, anthropologists have been critiquing individualism and or provincializing individualism for a very long time. So the presupposition in individualism is that the individual exists prior to and independent of social relationships, and the individual realizes themselves. The prime principal value, Louis Dumont said, is on the individual, right? So you realize yourself by finding meaning and purpose and agency within yourself. We think of this in terms of things like authenticity. The authentic individual is an individual who does not take direction from external things, but from internal ones, right? So in that sense, liberalism understands individuality in a certain type of way. And Tablighis, of course, don't understand it. The Tablighi conception of the pious subject and the pious order is built around the modeling of oneself and one's relationships, oneself on prophetic example, and one's relationships on the congregational relationships. And those are modeled on the Sahaba and the Rasulullah, right, on the Prophet. And so So there's this kind of modeling of those relationships. So you're appealing to an external authority and modeling your life on that external authority. But I think that one thing that I say is a little different from some of the others within the anthropology of religion is I'm still not convinced that these forms are completely mutually exclusive. That is to say, that I think that these all fit within broader ideas about modernity and sort of, like I say, directness, an ability to connect to some form of transcendence directly, independent of other people. So I think Tablighis remain committed to that. And the reason I focus on this is because I think it affords us a space to think more comparatively about the Tablighi Jamaat's relationship to Pentecostal Christianity or to other modern forms of social life that are emergent and compete for the kind of definition of moral order, to compete for defining what is religion and defining what is not religion. That competition, that contestation is, there are many, many different types of competitors for that space. So,
So the impression I'm getting from your book and the discussion is that, and you also use the word Western modernity and Western ideas. So it gives an impression that you are essentializing that the idea of individual as a focus of creating a moral order is a Western liberal thing. However, we also find such kind of debates about the role of individual in pre-colonial Islamic history, Ibn Tufayl and other people.
um, well, I don't know if I'd say Western. I certainly say liberal, and I think that I'm not sure that I attribute
I'm
that.
saying I get an impression that maybe it's a Western thing.
Well, I think one of the arguments I make in the book, uh, and this is true in the introduction, where I say that these are more intimate cultural forms than we take for granted, right? So I want to fit them all in this idea I construct of modernity as directness. I actually don't think that they're mutually exclusive or totally fall apart. I actually agree with that claim that there's some form of the individual at the individual, and some ideas that are in the Tablighi Jamaat I have a direct relationship to God that predate colonialism and predate modernity. I'm not questioning whether Islam has debated, is Christianity, Abrahamic religions, in general, have within them the possibility for a kind of individuality. But the idea that the individual shall be separate from social life and social relationships and be a kind of unity into themselves, that I'm not, I mean, I think that that's a historical question I would need more evidence for, to say that that particular form that we see in John Locke of what we call possessive individualism, the individual that owns themselves and is separate from society, I would say that that form of individuality is probably not very developed. If it existed prior to the emergence of Western liberalism and capitalism, I imagine it's not the dominant form. I would say that's that's a historical question that I would like more evidence for. But I do think that because the Abrahamic religions have this conception of autonomy of a subject relative to God, because the God, you and I have a direct relationship to God, and therefore I am connected to transcendental power. That part, I think, has probably existed in Islam for a long history. So we would have to tease apart, I think, some of these points. But I would like it to be, relatively clear that I think that the Tablighi conception of agency, selfhood, like Sabah Mahmood and others have argued, is actually different from the liberal one. But I think my aim was to show really that it's not as, these are not like fundamentally different. It's not like one belongs to the realm of traditions of Islam that are. I think that these are mutually sort of imbricated or close enough. They're not incommensurable in the sense that people can move between them, and they do. I mean, we know people who grow up very liberal, secular, and then end up in the Tablighi Jamaat. We also know, as I
Right.
say in the introduction, right, we also know people who grow up very pious and then become liberals. And that implies an intimacy between social forms, a proximity between social forms that are jostling for position within a social space. So I think, and I will find out when people respond to my work. I mean, I think I make it a case that's a little runs against a little grain of some of the thinking on within the anthropology of religion and the anthropology of Islam, that modernity has really reconfigured these religiosities in such a way that makes them more proximate to each other, more close to each other than we have given it credit. I often sit in workshops with people who work in the anthropology of Christianity, Catholicism, Protestantism. I think all of the Abrahamic religions have these social, emergent social forms in modernity, and they overlap, and they've been reconfigured in ways that are interesting to think about their comparisons as forms of modernity.
Fascinating. So one of the reasons this book raises so many questions is because it has very nuanced understanding of Tablighis, the piety, and overall religious idioms they use. So that is why I'm asking so many questions. Next question is, uh, you talk a lot about colonialism. In fact, there is one chapter like you specifically talk about the role of colonialism. How much is it relevant to your argument?
It is relevant. It is relevant. I mean, the forms of modernity that emerge in South Asia. This goes. I'll just step back because it goes back to your previous question, right? Which is what is pre-modern, right, or pre-modernity, or um, I I try to make the claim. I'm not a historian, and I'm happy to hear how historians respond to this claim. But my drawing on other historians, for instance, Barbara Metcalf and others, I think that it's fair to say that there was already this. For instance, we see this in Qasim Zaman's work, that the loss of sovereignty, Muslim sovereignty, Islamic sovereignty, Muslim sovereignty, the decline of the Mughal Empire did already precipitate, like Shah Waliullah, they precipitated a kind of revivalism, right? A desire for a purification of Islam, a desire to return to the original authentic Islam. And I'm sure if we look to the histories of Islam deeply, we will find forms like that. What I take colonialism to have done is to have created a sharp. One of the arguments I make is that it creates this divide historically between sort of authorities anchored in genealogical, right, which is blood and the inheritance of blood, and textual authority. Now, none of these are mutually exclusive. They can be compatible. They can bring together, but the idea that one could anybody you meet, regardless of our social origins, regardless of our social background, could ultimately become Hazrat, right? Could ultimately become the pious authority. I think modernity created the conditions for this kind of ability for anybody to achieve that kind of transcendence. And it did this with a series within South Asia, colonial transformations, and the kind of formulating of religious identity. So I'm not going to get into all the details, historical details, but in the history argument that I that I have, I make the case that colonial secularism, that is the sense that the British, after the First War of Independence, after the mutiny in 1857, after this, when the British take formal control of the Indian subcontinent, they institute policies of non-intervention. Those policies of non-intervention um, end up sort of granting autonomy to religion, right? A certain kind of autonomy. And the granting of autonomy to religion meant the formulation of Islamic law, Anglo Mohammedan law, formalized, I believe, in 1862. I don't have the dates in front of me. But right, so the formalization of the Islamic law, the policies that many post-colonial scholars have studied, for instance, the census and the division, the divisions between religious communities instituted through the census and census categories, through language policies, later through electoral policies. All of these policies of what we call governmentality created a kind of like divide and strengthened and reinforced the boundaries between religious groups. And then the sort of formulation, I argue, of Islamic law and Hindu law, and these laws then created this idea that there's a certain kind of autonomy to religious texts, that if you can, formulate the textual authority properly, that is the basis for proper religion, authentic religion. So I don't say that it's a complete rupture from pre-modern life, because I think revivalist currents like this have existed for instance, Shahwalullah. But I think that it was these transformations that turned this form of piety into, or this conception of textual authority into the dominant form. That is to say, genealogical authority was no longer, at least in certain spheres, urban, was no longer seen as the necessary condition for religious authority. This is the kind of argument I make, that modernity like sort of propels this form. Now, it's very interesting, important question. Now, could this have been possible, these transformations been possible without the colonial intervention? I would say probably yes.
Right.
And what I mean by that is, yes, this is the kind of history that we trace in South Asia. But I think that really the reason I hang my hat on modernity is because, to be honest, I think that these forms are pervasive, not just in South Asia, but also pervasive in the Western world and pervasive in Latin America and in places that don't have the same kind of colonial history in Turkey. So I think a deeper analysis would really look at, I think that a deeper analysis should do a kind of comparison between these forms. I think that this has to do with, frankly, I think that I don't develop this argument as much as I should maybe, but I think there are aspects of capitalism, for instance, that and mass mediated forms. I talk about print at length in my work, whether that Benedict Anderson's argument or those arguments, the rise of print capital, the rise of capitalism in general, and the idea that communities, religious communities or other forms, ethnic communities, there's some kind of generic self that exists, the Muslim, right? The Pakistani, the Pashtun, whatever those forms are emergent in modernity. And I think that there's another analysis that's not just colonial. That so I think your question is, would I make, if colonialism did not happen,
Right. What
would
would have
we
been the situation?
would these forms potentially exist? And I think they have a not one-to-one connection, but a kind of, yes, a kind of connection to modernity, and crucial to that, to capitalist relations and political economy. So I think that's another type of argument. I don't fully make that argument, but I would agree with that argument.
Fascinating, and I completely agree that there is a role of colonialism. There is an argument that the idea of hierarchy, whether it's about piety or whether it's about gender, about patriarchy, it's not new, or it's not the creation of Tablighi Jamaat, or it's not in reaction or response to colonialism. Rather, it existed in the medieval Islamic history, people like Ghazali, Tusi, Rumi, they were the people who generated this idea of hierarchical piety. I am sure you have read Zahra Ayubi's The Gendered Morality. She makes this argument. So,
Nothing.
so do you agree that there is nothing unique, or no, not so unique, about the very conception of piety and hierarchy as it exists in Tablighi Jamaat? Rather, it's the method, that is dawat, that is new. So not something substantively unique or new to Islamic piety. Rather, it's their method that is dawat is so captivating and unique. Do you agree with this?
I agree and disagree.
Okay.
I think that if we look into the history, I totally agree that there's Tablighi Jamaat did not invent patriarchy, and modernity certainly did not invent patriarchy. And we can go back to Ghazali, we can go back to Aristotle, and ideas about male female hierarchies have existed within all traditions, but within the Islamic tradition for a very long time. So I certainly my claim is not at all to claim that patriarchal forms are somehow, which is central to the hierarchies of the religion. But I do think that, and I mean, this is again a historical question, so I leave it to lots of scholars who want to engage my work and study it back into pre-modernity. But I do think that the particular type of formulation of the division between genders and the hierarchical arrangement, I think that Islamic tradition in general was probably had more competing and fluid forms, including on the gender question, like many other religions do prior to modernity. That is to say that male female divides, the divide between masculinity and femininity, was not configured in exactly the same way. This is a historical question. I leave it to others, but we see this all over in other parts of the world as well. That the idea of the men in the public sphere and women in the home, I do think that is something we can look into historically, and we find very varied forms of it. So, of course, patriarchy is not novel, um, but I do think that the kind of starkness that Tablighis draw, divide that Tablighis draw between masculinity and femininity, may may be one of the kind of products of this revivalisms that begin um, under colonialism. So that's something to look into. I think there are other scholars. I haven't read Zara Yubi's book. I definitely would like to read that book so I could respond maybe better to that. But I certainly think that other scholars, and I'm at this point blanking on her name, are looking at theological debates within fiqh on whether genders can be neatly divided in this kind of way. So that's one way. I do think the more important thing is what you said, though, that which is to say that Dawat as a transcendental practice, or I call it a ritual of transcendence, this capacity for preaching to others becoming the principal vehicle for becoming connected to God, right? The connection to God, the relation to God, grounded in a preaching process to others. Again, Dawat has also existed in Islamic history. And this idea of creating a sort of total Islamic community through Dawat, and that being the transcendent, I think that has been structured by the things I've argued in considerably. Ritual transcendence through Ritual transcendence could be through any number of things, but in this case, the Tabligis call it al Amal, right? The foundation of the foundation, effectively, of piety becomes making others pious. And I think in that, I defer. I'll let the historians look for this if they want. in pre-colonial life. And if there is more continuity than I'm arguing, then that's okay also. I mean, I'm happy to hear those arguments. But to me, it seems that the idea that to preach to others becomes the foundation for one's own iman because of the transcendent, that I think is, this an interesting thing that I imagine is modernity.
In the same line, you also focus, that was very interesting, you also focus a lot on the importance of family and sohbat for tablighis. It is their moral responsibility to make their families pious too. And then you also, if you want to talk about a little bit about pious masculinity, you develop this concept. So family and pious masculinity, please speak to
Yeah.
this.
Yeah, so one of the things I argue, and I have an article on biased masculinity, is that there's a certain, and I think that many others have described this also, right? There's a certain kind of of softness to the tablighi etiquette. And so much of what I'm working on is etiquette, really, and and the way that etiquette, that softness, that is seen as modeled on prophetic example, right? The prophet himself was of a, had self control. He had a certain kind of softness, and it was this soft. We all grow up hearing these stories, these accounts of the prophet, and so it's not news to us to hear this idea of the prophet's, his temperament, mizaj, as being this kind, right? And so I think that this idea of modeling oneself on the prophet is a modeling of a certain kind of softness, and that becomes, I argue, the model for Islamic authority and thus for sovereignty. So I argue that in the Tablighi Jamaat, men do a certain forms of labor that they, in this patriarchal structure, they would not do at home, cooking, cleaning, things like that. But actually many tablighis end up doing some of this at home as well, and cleaning and in the mosque and living in the mosque in a way that I say sort of reconfigures gender, right? And teaches tablighis a certain form of self-discipline and an ability to enact this prophetic model of softness. So I argue that this is one of the aims of the Tablighi Jamaat, to create men who can interact with others in this way, that I say contrasts with the broader Pakistani and other forms of masculinity. I think this softness is developed not uniquely by Tablighis, but in contrast to other forms of masculinity, and masculine agency, pious agency against other forms of more aggressive forms of masculinity. So I argue that Tablighis cultivate this within the domain of religion, but the idea is, of course, always that you have to go home and you have to enact this, and through the enactment of this, you draw your family also potentially into the arrangement, such that the home and the mosque become connected. Right? Tablighis often say something,
Fascinating.
right? That you know, if our feet cannot carry us, I'm roughly translating, if our feet cannot carry us to the mosque, how will they carry us to the sort of afterlife, right? How will
How
your,
do they say in Urdu? Can you say that in Urdu? Because I think they say in Urdu.
I'm not remembering, अगर हमारे पाँव जो हैं वो मस्जिद तक नहीं जाते तो हमें मतलब I'm forgetting what the second phrase of that is. I'll have to look in my notes. I mean, they make claims like this, right? मतलब हमारे पाँव मस्जिद तक नहीं जा सकते. I'll look it up. I have to look it up, right? But the idea being that the masjid and the house, the home, and the masjid are there's a certain kind of of connectivity, right? If you create a pious home, then your feet will take you to the mosque, right? But of course, you have to create the pious home if it's not there. Some people, I argue, are generationally tablighi. They grow up in this. Right? I think they say something like यहाँ से हमें दूसरी दुनिया तक कैसे लेके जाएंगे पाँव, something along those lines, right? I'm paraphrasing. अगर हमारे पाँव यहाँ से मस्जिद तक नहीं जा सकते तो दूसरी दुनिया कैसे लेके जाएंगे, something,
Fascinating.
right? Because there is
Very
this
powerful.
idea of this thread that you have to walk across, right, to get into the to Jannat, and so you have to be able to walk this thread, and the it's the work of going to the masjid, taking your feet and going, and not just to the masjid, but the traveling in dawah, that labor of training of the legs. It's the training of the senses, the training of the body, the training of one's habitus with capacity, such that one can live. So this is Asad and Mahmoud and all have already argued this. So you have to then create, I argue, you have to then create the pious home. You have to create an Islamic model, right? And central to that is parda, that women and men, that that you maintain that the gender segregation that is expected, um, with non-mahram, men who women are not supposed to interact with. So forms of niqab and various forms of parda. So establishing a pious home is a key element of this, but I argue that this is not always done, right? So if you think about hierarchy, it's not just religious hierarchy, there's also kinship hierarchies. So tablighis, I can preach to somebody who's younger than me and a subordinate to me, wives, children, younger brothers, but it's harder to preach to your father or to your uncles or to other people who are above you in authority, right? Your nana or dada or grandparents and so on. So I argue basically that the idea is that in enacting the piety in the home, the idea is, if you cannot preach to your father, you want your father because your father's commitment is key to your own commitment. If your father is against the Tablighi Jamaat, then this makes it hard to travel from the home to the mosque, right? So I argue that establishing a home that includes multiple generations is very key to the Tablighis. And the modeling of pious virtues is one way to attract and create that transformation. So that's kind of the way, so constituting the pious home. But of course, as social life is complex and people are complex, this doesn't necessarily happen, right? Not everybody is drawn to the Tablighi Jamaat. So one of the things I argue is the same ethics that creates self-control in the masjid, in the mosque, is meant to be an ethics that allows you, in a sense, to accept that not everyone in your home is going to accept that model of piety. They may be of a different firqa, they may be a different denomination like Brelvi, or they may be something else. So I argue that the process of piety and the creation of pious subjects also shapes how you interact with other people outside of the masjid and in the world.
Interesting. So my last question now: how do these arguments, concepts, theories, claims travel beyond Pakistan and Tablighis? First of all, do they? Of course they do. I know that. But in what ways they inform us our understanding of religion and modernity, or religion and politics in the 21st century?
Yeah. I think that religion and politics are, of course, inseparable. And I think that, the attempt to separate them is a key element of politics. The attempt to unite them, as Islamists do, or to separate them as secularists do, these are the modern dynamics of the modern state, the modern nation state and modernity. Okay, the division between religion and non-religion, religion and politics, religion and economy, these boundaries are worked and reworked by all kinds of actors competing for the mantle of authority. Okay. What I found most fascinating about the Tablighi Jamaat is not that they're apolitical. That is, in my framework, that's a nonsensical claim that somebody is apolitical. But what I did find is that the desire to separate the religious and the political, or the religious and the economic, in formal terms, right? You cannot cultivate the pious subjectivities of the self that are created in the Tablighi Jamaat in a Islamic bank or in an Islamist political party or in the protests around blasphemy, or whatever those spaces are. So there's a formal division between religion and these spaces. Now it's reunited because Tablighis believe religion is the hierarchical form. So it should inform everything else, right? The dunya should be informed by the religious. Economic life should be informed by the religious. Political life should be informed by the religious. But the separation in Dawat is very crucial. It creates, I argue, that the sort of disciplining of the modern institutions, whether that be the state, the corporation, the market, right? Piety becomes a disciplining structure of these other forms of power and authority. And Tablighis believe that's the basis for moral life and the moral reproduction of Islamic life. What's important about this? Well, I think that there are many, many movements out there in the world that are attaching themselves to particularly new forms of hierarchy, not just Islamic movements, but Jewish movements and Christian movements and Hindu movements and all kinds of other forms that are trying to enact this kind of separation and provide a model of sociality, relationality that can reconfigure other aspects of life. And so I think that that's a phenomena that's happening throughout the world. And I think that that is an interesting thing to think about, because hierarchies of the kind that I'm describing are often just treated as negative, but they have a value to the people that are participate in them, and they provide a vision of order or morality that people see are a basis for transcending many of the problems that I think arise from crises within the nation state, within capitalism, and within these other things we're seeing around the world, and religious revivalisms are happening around the world as one form of response, not as one form of response. In the same way that liberalism responds to these things, we can understand analytically how these are emerging. And I guess one last thing I would say is that hierarchies are not all the same. Not everyone that enacts a pious self or a conservative self or a religious form of moral order is the same as everyone else other form, right? I mean, so I in my last chapter I deal with blasphemy politics, and I say, well, Tablighis understand blasphemy to be a real moral danger and a threat to life, but this doesn't necessarily throw them into hardcore championing of the type of blasphemy politics. So I think these are important phenomena in the world that we who are watching these crises around the world unfold should attend to and think about and understand. So, because they're empirically both very pervasive, and they also are one way in which people are responding to crisis.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khan. I'm really looking forward to seeing you once you're back to the US.
I look forward to it as well, and look forward to further conversations, and would love to hear more of your thoughts about the
Thank you.
book.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you. Sure.